Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Oregon's timber country. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn rains of 1927 fell with particular persistence across the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, turning the logging roads into rivers of mud and forcing the sawmills of Clackamas County to extend their operating seasons well into November. In those days, before mechanization transformed the timber industry, the work was brutal, and the workers were transient souls who followed employment from camp to camp, mill to mill, carrying their few possessions and their accumulated grievances like worn tools in canvas sacks. Among the scattered settlements that dotted the mountainous terrain between Portland and Mount Hood, the town of Millhaven distinguished itself primarily by its unremarkable nature. Founded in 1889 as a company town for the Henderson Lumber Company, it consisted of little more than a main street lined with functional buildings, worker housing arranged in neat rows behind the commercial district, and the ever-present sawmill that dominated the eastern edge of town with its towering smokestack and the constant screech of blade against timber. The Henderson Mill operated 6 days a week during peak season, processing logs hauled down from the mountain cutting sites by teams of oxen and later by steam-powered tractors that left deep ruts in the forest roads. The work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring men of exceptional physical stamina and a certain resignation to the possibility of sudden death or permanent disability. Industrial accidents were so common that Dr. Franklin Morse, the town's only physician, maintained a standing order with the Portland morgue for pine coffins in 3 standard sizes. At the far end of what locals called Sawdust Street, where the organized town gave way to scattered cabins and eventually the dense forest, stood a 2-story structure that would become the center of one of the most methodically documented criminal enterprises in Pacific Northwest history. The building, constructed in 1889 as overflow housing for mill supervisors, had been converted to a boarding house in 1924 following the tragic death of its owner, Jeremiah Hastings, in a logging accident that witnesses described as both sudden and inevitable. Jeremiah had been working as a mill foreman for 15 years when a cable snapped during a log loading operation, sending a massive Douglas fir timber crushing down upon him with enough force to break every bone in his chest. He died instantly, according to the coroner's report filed by Dr. Morse, though witnesses claimed his screams continued for several minutes after the timber was removed from his body. The accident was attributed to equipment failure, though some workers privately suggested that Jeremiah's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks preceding his death had contributed to the safety lapses that made the incident possible. Cordelia Hastings, widow of the deceased mill foreman, inherited the property along with debts that exceeded its apparent value. At 43 years of age, she faced the prospect of destitution in a region where opportunities for women of her circumstances were severely limited. The decision to operate the building as a boarding house seemed practical, even inevitable, given the constant demand for temporary housing among the workforce that flowed through Millhaven with each new timber contract. Mrs. Hastings was a woman of medium height and unremarkable appearance, with graying-brown hair that she wore in a severe bun and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings with mechanical precision. Those who knew her during her marriage described her as a dutiful wife who rarely spoke unless directly addressed and who maintained her household with an efficiency that bordered on obsession. Following her husband's death, however, neighbors noticed a transformation in her demeanor that was subtle but unmistakable. Where she had once been merely quiet, she became actively secretive. Where she had been efficient, she became calculating. The few social connections she had maintained during her marriage were quietly severed, and she began conducting her affairs with a deliberate isolation that aroused suspicion among those who had known her family for years. When questioned about her plans for the property, she would respond only that she intended to make the best use possible of what her husband had left her. The boarding house that Cordelia established differed from similar establishments in subtle but significant ways that would not become apparent until years later, when investigators began examining the patterns that characterized her operation. Unlike the rough accommodations typically available to mill workers, the Hastings boarding house offered amenities that seemed almost luxurious by comparison. The rooms were clean and well-maintained, the meals were substantial and carefully prepared, and the atmosphere was one of respectability that attracted workers who possessed both the means and the inclination to pay premium rates for superior lodging. The building itself had been modified extensively during the conversion process. Mrs. Hastings had invested considerable resources in renovations that went far beyond simple cosmetic improvements. The original room layout had been reconfigured to provide 8 individual chambers, each equipped with a bed, washstand, and wardrobe of identical design. The common areas had been furnished with heavy oak tables and chairs that conveyed an impression of permanence and stability unusual in establishments catering to transient workers. More significantly, the basement had been completely excavated and reinforced, creating a storage area that extended beneath the entire footprint of the building. This space, accessible through a narrow staircase hidden behind the kitchen pantry, was divided into multiple chambers that served various functions in the boarding house's operations. Mrs. Hastings claimed this area was necessary for storing the supplies required to feed and house her guests, though the size and complexity of the basement seemed disproportionate to such simple needs. According to employment records maintained by the Henderson Lumber Company and preserved in the Oregon State Archives, the boarding house maintained consistent occupancy throughout its 3 years of operation. Workers would arrive, typically on Saturday evenings after receiving their weekly wages, and settle into accommodations that appeared to justify the premium rates charged for room and board. The standard weekly fee of $8 represented nearly a quarter of a typical mill worker's wages, but the quality of the accommodations and meals made this expense seem reasonable to men accustomed to far more primitive conditions. The boarding house attracted a particular type of worker, men who possessed skills that commanded higher wages and who preferred to maintain a degree of respectability even while living far from established communities. These were not the rough laborers who formed the majority of the mill workforce, but rather the specialists whose expertise was essential to efficient operations. Millwrights, saw filers, equipment mechanics, and experienced timber graders found the Hastings establishment more suited to their status and income than the crude bunkhouses that housed common laborers. What distinguished the Hastings establishment, and what would eventually draw the attention of local authorities, was the pattern of additional charges that appeared without explanation or prior agreement. These supplementary fees, always presented the morning after a worker's arrival, invariably consumed whatever money remained after the initial payment, leaving the affected individuals entirely dependent on their next wages and consequently unable to seek alternative accommodation until their financial situation improved. The first documented complaint regarding these mysterious charges was filed with the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office in March of 1925 by Silas Maddox, a timber faller from the eastern Oregon town of Bend. Maddox's statement, carefully transcribed by Deputy Sheriff Amos Krensky, describes an experience that would be repeated with troubling consistency over the following 2 years. The deputy, a methodical man in his late 30s who had served in law enforcement for 12 years, initially approached the complaint with skepticism typical of rural officers dealing with disputes between transient workers and local businesses. Maddox had arrived at the boarding house on Friday evening, March 13, 1925, carrying $43 in wages from his work at a temporary cutting operation near Government Camp. He was an experienced timber faller with 18 years in the woods. a man whose reputation for reliability had earned him premium wages and steady employment despite the dangerous nature of his work. His supervisor at the government camp operation, Malcolm Henricks, described him as one of the most competent workers he had ever employed, a man whose judgment could be trusted in even the most challenging cutting situations. The circumstances of Maddox's arrival at the boarding house were routine. He had completed a 6-week contract at government camp and planned to spend several days in Millhaven before traveling to his next assignment at a cutting operation near Mount Angel. The Hastings boarding house had been recommended by another worker who praised its cleanliness and the quality of its meals, factors that justified the premium rates in the opinion of men who earned enough to afford such luxuries. Maddox paid the standard $8 weekly rate upon arrival and was shown to a well-appointed room on the second floor. He dined in the common room with 3 other boarders, men whose names he later learned were Ezekiel Morse, a saw filer from Salem, Augustus Crowley, a millwright specializing in steam engine maintenance, and Phineas Blackthorne, a timber grader with extensive experience in selective cutting operations. The meal was substantial and well prepared, consisting of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that Mrs. Hastings claimed to have baked that afternoon. Following dinner, the boarders gathered in the common room for conversation and card games that continued until nearly 10 o'clock. Maddox later told Deputy Krensky that he remembered feeling unusually tired during these evening activities, though he attributed his fatigue to the physical demands of his recent work. The other men seemed similarly affected, with conversation becoming increasingly sluggish, and several of the group retiring to their rooms earlier than they had initially intended. According to his sworn statement, Maddox awoke Saturday morning feeling unusually disoriented and groggy, with no clear recollection of events following the card games the previous evening. His clothes were neatly folded on the chair beside his bed, though he had no memory of undressing or preparing for sleep. More troubling was his discovery that his personal belongings had been rearranged in his room, with items placed in locations different from where he remembered leaving them. When Maddox presented himself for breakfast, Mrs. Hastings informed him that he owed an additional $34.50 for what she described as special services and accommodations that he had requested during the night. The amount was calculated with mathematical precision, $15 for premium meals that he had allegedly ordered for the following week, $12 for extensive laundry services including cleaning and pressing of his entire wardrobe, and $7.50 for what was described as personal assistance with correspondence and private matters. When he protested that he had made no such requests and could not remember any conversation regarding additional charges, she produced a handwritten note that appeared to be in his own handwriting, detailing specific requests for the services in question. The note was written on boarding house stationery and signed with what appeared to be his signature, though Maddox insisted he had no memory of writing any such document. The handwriting on the note was sufficiently similar to Maddox's own that Deputy Krensky could not definitively determine it to be fraudulent, though Maddox insisted he had no memory of writing any such document. When the deputy asked Mrs. Hastings to explain the circumstances under which the note had been written, she replied that Maddox had approached her after the other boarders had retired, expressing concerns about the adequacy of his clothing for his upcoming work assignment and requesting assistance with various personal matters that he was embarrassed to discuss in the presence of other men. More troubling was Maddox's description of his physical and mental state following the incident. He reported severe headaches that persisted for 3 days after leaving the boarding house, accompanied by nausea and what he characterized as a persistent mental fog that made concentration difficult and left him feeling as though his thoughts belonged to someone else. The headaches were unlike any he had experienced before, beginning deep behind his eyes and radiating through his skull with an intensity that prevented sleep and made exposure to bright light almost unbearable. Dr. Franklin Morse, Millhaven's only physician and a man with nearly 20 years of medical experience in timber communities, examined Maddox at Deputy Krensky's request, but could find no obvious signs of illness or injury. His medical notes, preserved in the Clackamas County Health Department records, describe symptoms consistent with what he termed nervous exhaustion, possibly related to the physical demands of mill work and the effects of extended alcohol consumption, though Maddox insisted he had consumed no alcohol during his stay at the boarding house. The physician's examination was thorough by the standards of rural medical practice in 1925. Dr. Morse checked Maddox's pupils for signs of drug intoxication, examined his skin for evidence of physical trauma, and conducted tests of his reflexes and coordination that revealed no obvious abnormalities. However, the doctor noted that Maddox displayed an unusual degree of anxiety and confusion that seemed disproportionate to his circumstances, along with memory gaps that were more extensive than would be expected from simple fatigue or alcohol consumption. Similar complaints followed with remarkable consistency throughout 1925 and into 1926. Barnaby Wessels, a millwright who specialized in saw maintenance and who had earned a reputation for mechanical expertise that made him valuable to mills throughout the region, filed an identical complaint in April after experiencing the same pattern of mysterious charges and memory gaps. Wessels was a man of 41 years whose steady employment and reliable character had enabled him to accumulate savings that represented financial security unusual among mill workers. Wessels had arrived at the boarding house on a Thursday evening in April, carrying $67 in wages and savings that he intended to use for purchasing new tools and equipment. Like Maddox, he paid the standard rate for accommodation and enjoyed a substantial dinner in the company of other boarders. His recollections of the evening were similar to those described by Maddox: increasing fatigue during social activities, early retirement to his room, and awakening the next morning with no memory of preparing for sleep. The charges presented to Wessels were even more extensive than those imposed upon Maddox. Mrs. Hastings produced a handwritten note, apparently in his handwriting, requesting premium accommodation upgrades, specialized meal preparation, extensive cleaning services, and personal assistance with business correspondence. The total amount of these charges was $61.25, leaving him with less than $6 to his name. When Wessels protested the charges, Mrs. Hastings produced additional documentation that purported to show his authorization for each service. These included what appeared to be his signature on receipts for laundry services, meal upgrades, and room cleaning that he insisted he had never requested. More troubling was a letter, apparently written in his handwriting, requesting assistance with personal financial matters and authorizing Mrs. Hastings to act on his behalf in certain business dealings. The letter contained details about his personal finances and employment history that he could not understand how she had obtained. It referenced specific amounts of money he had saved, tools he owned, and future work assignments that he had discussed with no one except his immediate supervisors. The accuracy of this information was so complete that Deputy Krensky initially suspected Wessels might be lying about his lack of memory. Though the man's obvious distress and confusion seemed genuine, Roscoe Thorne, employed at the Henderson Mill as a log scaler and a man whose mathematical skills and attention to detail made him valuable for determining the board feet contained in timber shipments, filed 3 separate complaints during the summer of 1925, each describing identical circumstances, despite his growing awareness of the pattern and his attempts to remain vigilant against whatever was causing his blackouts. Thorne's case was particularly significant because his position at the mill provided him with credibility, and his methodical nature led him to maintain detailed personal records that documented his experiences at the boarding house. Following his first encounter with the mysterious charges, he began keeping a diary that recorded his activities, expenses, and observations in minute detail. His subsequent stays at the boarding house were motivated by a determination to understand what was happening to him and to other workers. The diary entries from Thorne's stays at the boarding house reveal a man increasingly desperate to maintain control over his own mind and memory. He describes various strategies he attempted to employ, retiring to his room immediately after dinner, avoiding the common areas where social activities occurred, even attempting to remain awake throughout the night. Despite these precautions, he consistently awoke with gaps in his memory and found himself confronted with charges for services he could not recall requesting. More disturbing were Thorne's observations about the other boarders who stayed at the establishment during his visits. He noted that men who arrived with substantial wages invariably departed with empty pockets, all reporting similar experiences of memory loss and unexpected charges. His diary contains detailed descriptions of conversations with fellow victims, revealing a pattern so consistent that it seemed impossible to attribute to coincidence or individual failings. What made these complaints particularly significant was the credibility of the men filing them. These were not vagrants or drifters whose testimony might be dismissed due to alcohol or mental instability. They were skilled workers with steady employment, men whose supervisors described them as reliable and competent. Their consistent reports of memory gaps and unexplained charges represented a pattern that Deputy Krensky found increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about the boarding house's operations that suggested a level of sophistication far beyond simple, opportunistic theft. Krensky's reports, filed monthly with the county sheriff's office and preserved in remarkable detail, document the discovery of irregularities in the boarding house's operations that pointed to systematic criminal activity rather than isolated incidents of fraud. Deputy Krensky was a methodical investigator whose 12 years of law enforcement experience had taught him to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating criminal complaints. Born in Wisconsin and educated through the 8th grade, he had come to Oregon in 1910 seeking opportunities in the timber industry, but had found his calling in law enforcement after serving as a deputy during a labor dispute that required careful documentation and objective investigation. His initial investigation of the boarding house complaints focused on financial irregularities and potential fraud schemes. However, as he delved deeper into the establishment's operations, he discovered evidence of activities that went far beyond simple theft or overcharging. The basement storage area, which Mrs. Hastings claimed was used for storing supplies and equipment, contained materials that suggested purposes far removed from normal boarding house operations. Among the most troubling discoveries were personal effects from dozens of former boarders, carefully organized and labeled with dates and names spanning back to the boarding house's opening. These items ranged from clothing and personal tools to letters, photographs, and documents that contained intimate details about the men's personal lives and backgrounds. The collection was so extensive and systematically organized that it resembled an archive rather than simple storage. When questioned about these possessions, Mrs. Hastings explained that they represented security deposits left by boarders who had departed without settling their accounts. She maintained detailed ledgers showing outstanding debts for each name, amounts that conveniently equaled the apparent value of the confiscated items. The ledgers were meticulously maintained, with entries written in her careful handwriting and calculations that balanced to the penny. However, Krensky's investigation revealed that several of the men listed in these ledgers had no recollection of leaving any personal effects as collateral and insisted they had settled all debts before departing. When the deputy contacted former boarders whose names appeared in the ledgers, he discovered a pattern of confusion and memory gaps that extended beyond their experiences at the boarding house itself. More troubling was the discovery of what appeared to be a photographic darkroom in a corner of the basement, complete with cameras, developing chemicals, and stacks of photographic plates. The equipment was of professional quality and appeared to have been used recently, though Mrs. Hastings claimed no knowledge of photography and insisted the equipment had belonged to her deceased husband. When questioned about this equipment, Mrs. Hastings suggested that Jeremiah had intended to document the local logging industry for historical purposes, though no such photographs were found among his effects, and former associates of the deceased mill foreman expressed surprise at the suggestion that he had possessed any interest in photography. The explanation seemed implausible, given the sophistication of the equipment and the obvious expense it represented. Deputy Krensky's examination of the photographic materials revealed images that provided disturbing insight into the boarding house's operations. Many of the photographic plates contained images of men who appeared to be unconscious or heavily intoxicated, photographed in their rooms at the boarding house under circumstances that suggested they were unaware of being recorded. The subjects were in various states of undress and in positions that would have been embarrassing or compromising if the images were to be made public. The systematic nature of the photography suggested careful planning and deliberate documentation rather than random or opportunistic image-making. Each photograph was labeled with a date and the subject's name, and many were accompanied by detailed notes describing the circumstances under which the image was captured. The notes revealed that subjects had been photographed during periods when they were incapacitated, unable to consent to or resist the documentation of their condition. The investigation took a more ominous turn in the spring of 1926, when Deputy Krensky began experiencing what his superiors would later describe as an unhealthy obsession with the boarding house case. According to Sheriff Benjamin Hartwell's reports, Krensky had begun making unscheduled visits to the establishment at all hours, questioning boarders and searching for evidence of wrongdoing with a fervor that concerned both his colleagues and the subjects of his investigation. Sheriff Hartwell was a political appointee whose primary qualifications for office were his family connections and his ability to maintain order without generating controversy that might affect local business interests. He had held the position for 6 years and had developed a reputation for avoiding investigations that might complicate relationships with prominent citizens or established businesses. His tolerance for Krensky's intensive investigation of the boarding house reflected both the deputy's reputation for competence and the sheriff's own uncertainty about the significance of the evidence being uncovered. Krensky's behavior during this period, as documented in his increasingly erratic reports, suggested that he had developed a theory about Mrs. Hastings's methods that went beyond simple fraud. He had become convinced that she was using some form of chemical agent to incapacitate her boarders, though he could provide no concrete evidence to support this hypothesis. His reports describe finding suspicious residues in drinking glasses and detecting unusual odors in the boarding house kitchen, though subsequent analysis by county officials revealed nothing conclusive. The deputy's investigations during this period became increasingly intrusive and unpredictable. He would arrive at the boarding house without warning, demanding to inspect the premises, and question both Mrs. Hastings and her current guests about their experiences. His manner became increasingly aggressive, and his questions suggested suspicions that went beyond the original complaints about overcharging. Mrs. Hastings responded to these intrusions with a combination of cooperation and resistance that seemed calculated to avoid direct confrontation while limiting the scope of Krinsky's access to evidence. She would permit him to search common areas, but insisted that guest rooms could not be entered without warrants or the explicit consent of their occupants. She provided access to her financial records, but claimed that certain documents were stored elsewhere and could not be immediately produced. The deputy's mental state deteriorated rapidly throughout the spring of 1927, culminating in what Dr. Morse diagnosed as a severe nervous breakdown. According to medical records preserved in the county health department files, Krinsky had begun displaying symptoms of severe paranoia and anxiety, claiming that he was being watched and followed by unnamed individuals connected to the boarding house operation. His reports from this period describe elaborate surveillance networks and conspiracy theories that his superiors found increasingly difficult to credit. He claimed that Mrs. Hastings was part of a larger organization that operated similar establishments throughout the region, and that his investigation was being monitored by individuals who would take action to protect the network if he came too close to exposing its operations. The deputy's behavior became increasingly erratic during his final weeks of active duty. He was found on multiple occasions conducting surveillance of the boarding house from concealed positions in the surrounding forest, claiming to be documenting the activities of mysterious visitors who arrived under cover of darkness. When questioned about these alleged visitors, he could provide no coherent descriptions and no evidence of their existence beyond his own observations. In May of 1927, Sheriff Hartwell placed Krinsky on indefinite medical leave following an incident in which the deputy was found wandering the forest near the boarding house in the early morning hours, claiming to be conducting surveillance of a meeting between Mrs. Hastings and unidentified conspirators. When questioned, Krinsky could provide no coherent explanation for his presence or his allegations, and subsequent investigation revealed no evidence of any such meeting having taken place. Dr. Morse's examination of the deputy revealed symptoms consistent with severe nervous exhaustion and possible paranoid ideation. The physician's report described Krinsky as suffering from delusions of persecution and an obsessive preoccupation with the boarding house case that had begun to interfere with his ability to function in his professional capacity. The doctor recommended extended rest and removal from all duties related to the investigation. Krinsky never returned to duty and eventually left the area entirely. According to subsequent county employment records, his departure effectively ended the official investigation of the boarding house, as Sheriff Hartwell, faced with more pressing concerns and lacking any concrete evidence of criminal activity, chose to classify the complaints as civil disputes between a landlady and her tenants rather than matters requiring continued law enforcement attention. The pattern of mysterious charges and memory gaps continued throughout the summer of 1927, but without official support, individual complaints were largely ignored by local authorities. The boarding house maintained its reputation among workers as a premium establishment, though word began to spread through the transient mill worker community about the unusual experiences reported by former guests. The warnings that circulated among workers were often vague and difficult to verify, as men who had experienced problems at the boarding house frequently found themselves unable to provide specific details about what had happened to them. The combination of memory gaps and the embarrassment associated with being swindled led many victims to avoid discussing their experiences, while those who did speak out often found their accounts met with skepticism from listeners who had not experienced similar problems. Despite the growing reputation for unusual incidents, the boarding house continued to attract guests throughout 1927. The quality of accommodations and meals remained superior to alternatives available to mill workers, and Mrs. Hastings's reputation for maintaining an orderly and respectable establishment appealed to workers who possessed the means to afford premium lodging. The pattern of mysterious charges and memory gaps was sufficiently subtle that new arrivals often dismissed warnings as the complaints of men who had simply overindulged in alcohol or made poor financial decisions. The end came suddenly on the night of September 23, 1927, in circumstances that would add new dimensions to the boarding house mystery and provide disturbing confirmation of the suspicions that had driven Deputy Krensky to his breakdown. Mill workers arriving for their morning shift on September 24th discovered the establishment standing empty, its front door standing open, and its interior showing clear signs of hasty evacuation. Mrs. Hastings had vanished during the night, along with what appeared to be all portable valuables from the establishment. Her personal belongings were gone, as were various items of furniture and equipment that could be easily transported. More significantly, the basement storage area had been completely emptied, with all of the personal effects from former boarders and the photographic equipment removed without trace. The thoroughness of the evacuation suggested careful planning and substantial resources. The removal of materials from the basement would have required multiple trips and considerable effort, yet no witnesses reported seeing any unusual activity during the night. The boarding house was located at the end of a street that received little traffic after dark, but the loading and transportation of substantial quantities of materials should have been noticed by neighbors or late-night passers-by. More significantly, 3 current boarders had also disappeared without trace. Jasper Crenshaw, a saw operator from Southern Oregon, Virgil Donovan, a timber grader with 15 years of mill experience, and Quincy Holbrook, a maintenance specialist known for his mechanical expertise, had simply vanished along with their landlady. Their personal belongings remained in their rooms, apparently untouched, and their employers reported that none had collected final paychecks that would have been available the following day. The disappearance of the 3 boarders was particularly puzzling because all were men with established reputations and strong ties to the local community. Crenshaw had been employed at the Henderson Mill for 8 months and had developed friendships among his fellow workers that made his sudden departure without explanation seem completely out of character. Donovan was known for his methodical nature and his practice of maintaining detailed correspondence with family members who would have been informed of any planned departure. Quincy Holbrook's case was perhaps the most troubling, as he had recently invested substantial money in specialized tools that represented the primary assets of his trade. The tools remained in his room, carefully arranged and maintained, according to his usual practice, suggesting that his departure had been unplanned and involuntary. His supervisor at the mill, where he was responsible for maintaining the complex, steam-powered equipment that drove the saws and other machinery, described him as indispensable to operations and expressed disbelief that he would abandon his position without notice. Sheriff Hartwell's investigation into the disappearances was limited by the resources available to rural law enforcement in 1927 and by his own skepticism about the significance of the boarding house complaints. His report, filed 3 days after the discovery, concluded that Mrs. Hastings had likely absconded to avoid mounting debts and that the missing boarders had probably departed to seek work elsewhere, abandoning their belongings to avoid settling their own financial obligations. This explanation satisfied few who were familiar with the missing men or who understood the circumstances of their employment. All 3 were described by their employers and associates as reliable individuals who would not have abandoned legitimate wages without explanation. The timing of their disappearance, coinciding exactly with Mrs. Hastings's evacuation, suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Mrs. Hastings had maintained accounts with several banks in Portland and had made substantial withdrawals in the weeks preceding her disappearance. The amounts involved suggested that she had accumulated considerable wealth during her 3 years of operating the boarding house, far more than would be expected from legitimate room and board charges, even at premium rates. More troubling was the discovery that she had been in regular correspondence with individuals in other timber communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The remaining letters found in her evacuated office referenced similar operations in towns throughout Oregon and Washington, suggesting coordination with a network of individuals involved in comparable activities. The boarding house stood empty for several months following the disappearances, gradually attracting the attention of drifters and vagrants who found its unlocked doors convenient for temporary shelter. Local authorities made occasional efforts to secure the building, but lacking clear legal authority and faced with more pressing concerns, they generally ignored the deteriorating structure. The few transients who attempted to use the abandoned boarding house for shelter reported experiences that echoed the complaints of its former paying guests. Temporary occupants frequently described waking with severe headaches and memory gaps, often finding their few possessions rearranged or missing entirely. More disturbing were reports of finding handwritten notes, apparently in their own handwriting, describing thoughts and activities they could not recall. These reports might have been dismissed as the products of alcohol or mental instability common among the transient population, but their consistency with earlier complaints suggested that whatever had affected the boarding house's paying customers continued to operate even in the absence of Mrs. Hastings. This realization added a new and troubling dimension to speculation about the establishment's methods of operation. Local residents began to avoid the abandoned building entirely after a vagrant named Cornelius Dunphy was found dead in one of the upstairs rooms in January of 1928. Dr. Morse's examination revealed that Dunphy had died of exposure, apparently after becoming lost or disoriented within the building during a winter storm. However, the circumstances of his death raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Dunphy had been discovered fully clothed, but with his boots removed and placed neatly beside his bed, suggesting that he had prepared for sleep in a normal manner before succumbing to the cold. More puzzling was the discovery of a handwritten note beside his body, apparently in his own handwriting, describing plans for extensive renovations to the building and expressing gratitude for assistance with personal matters that he had never mentioned to anyone who knew him. The note was written on boarding house stationery that should not have been available in the abandoned building, and its contents suggested familiarity with details about Dunphy's personal life and background that he had never discussed with local residents. The handwriting was sufficiently similar to his usual script that Dr. Morse concluded it had been written by Dunphy himself, though the content seemed entirely inconsistent with his mental state and circumstances. In 1929, the property was claimed by Clackamas County for unpaid taxes and sold at public auction to the Henderson Lumber Company, which intended to demolish the structure and use the land for log storage. The demolition, carried out by a crew of local workers under the supervision of a company foreman, Lester Holt, led to discoveries that would provide new insight into the boarding house's operations, while raising additional questions about the fate of its missing occupants. The demolition crew consisted of 6 experienced workers who had been employed by the Henderson Company for several years and who were familiar with the boarding house's reputation for unusual incidents. Despite their familiarity with local legends about the building, they were unprepared for the discoveries they would make during the demolition process. While clearing the basement, workers uncovered a hidden chamber behind what appeared to be a false wall constructed of carefully fitted stones. The concealed room, approximately 8 feet square and accessible through a narrow opening hidden behind stored lumber, contained materials that revealed the sophistication and scope of Mrs. Hastings's operations. The hidden chamber had been constructed with obvious attention to concealment and security. The entrance was disguised to appear as part of the foundation wall, and the interior was lined with wooden shelving and storage cabinets that had been built to precise specifications. The room contained no windows or external access, and its existence would not have been apparent to casual inspection of the building. Among the most significant discoveries were dozens of glass photographic plates showing images of men in various states of unconsciousness or extreme intoxication. The subjects, many of whom were recognizable as former boarders based on employment records maintained by local mills, appeared to have been photographed without their knowledge or consent. The images showed men in compromising positions and states of undress, apparently captured while they were incapacitated and unable to resist documentation. The photographic plates were organized with systematic precision, each labeled with the subject's name, date of capture, and detailed notes describing the circumstances under which the image was taken. The notes revealed that subjects had been photographed during periods when they were completely unconscious, unable to consent to or prevent the documentation of their condition. Accompanying the photographs were detailed written records that provided insight into the systematic nature of the boarding house's operations. These documents, written in Mrs. Hastings' careful handwriting, contained extensive notes about the personal weaknesses, secrets, and vulnerabilities of individual boarders. The records revealed that she had developed an intricate system of information gathering based on systematic questioning of incapacitated victims. According to these notes, Mrs. Hastings had used the periods when boarders were unconscious to extract detailed information about their personal histories, family relationships, financial situations, and potentially embarrassing or damaging secrets. The information was recorded with methodical precision, including details about family members, past employment, personal debts, romantic relationships, and any activities or associations that might be used to damage a person's reputation or standing in the community. The scope and detail of the information collected was remarkable for its thoroughness and its potential value for blackmail or intimidation purposes. The records included not only basic biographical information, but also psychological profiles that analyzed each subject's fears, weaknesses, and potential vulnerabilities to various forms of pressure or manipulation. More disturbing were references to the systematic use of this information to maintain control over former boarders long after they had departed from the establishment. The records detailed ongoing blackmail operations that extended far beyond the original charges that had consumed the men's immediate resources. Mrs. Hastings had apparently continued to extract money and services from former guests by threatening to expose embarrassing information or compromising photographs unless they complied with her demands. The records also detailed financial arrangements with various individuals in the local business community who apparently purchased information about employees, union organizers, and potential troublemakers. Mill supervisors, company executives, and local politicians were listed as regular customers for intelligence that could be used to identify and neutralize threats to their interests. These arrangements revealed that the boarding house had served as the center of an extensive intelligence gathering network that monitored and controlled workers throughout the region. The systematic collection of compromising information about mill workers provided those in positions of authority with tools for preventing union organizing, suppressing political dissent, and maintaining control over a workforce that might otherwise have challenged existing power structures. The financial records associated with these arrangements showed that Mrs. Hastings had received substantial payments for her services, far exceeding the income that could be generated through legitimate boarding house operations. The amounts involved suggested that information gathering and blackmail had been her primary sources of revenue, with the boarding house itself serving primarily as a cover for these more profitable activities. Perhaps most disturbing were the detailed notes describing Mrs. Hastings's methods for incapacitating her victims. The records revealed that she had been systematically adding carefully measured doses of chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative commonly known as knockout drops, to the evening meals of selected boarders. The drug would render victims unconscious within an hour, while leaving them with little or no memory of events during their incapacitated state. The sophistication of the drugging operation suggested professional knowledge of pharmacology that seemed beyond what might be expected of a mill foreman's widow. The records included detailed notes about dosage calculations based on individual body weight and apparent tolerance, suggesting systematic experimentation and refinement of technique over time. References to specific suppliers and detailed cost accounting indicated that the operation had been conducted on a scale that required substantial financial investment and careful planning. More troubling were references in the documents to assistance from individuals identified only by initials or coded names. Financial records showed regular payments to unnamed accomplices, and correspondence fragments suggested coordination with similar operations in other logging communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The scope of the network appeared to extend well beyond Millhaven, with evidence pointing to systematic intelligence gathering and worker control efforts throughout the region's timber industry. The demolition crew's discoveries were reported to county authorities, but by 1929, most of the original investigators had died, retired, or moved away. Sheriff Hartwell had left office following his defeat in the 1928 election. Deputy Krinsky remained missing, and Dr. Morse had relocated to Portland to join a larger medical practice. The new sheriff, lacking familiarity with the original complaints and faced with what appeared to be historical evidence rather than an active case, filed the materials as evidence but conducted no substantive investigation. The photographic plates and documents were eventually transferred to the Oregon State Archives as part of a general effort to preserve historical materials related to the region's timber industry. They were cataloged and stored with thousands of other documents from the same period, becoming lost among the vast collection of materials that documented the economic and social history of the Pacific Northwest. The materials remained largely forgotten among the archives until 1961, when they were discovered by Clifford Reeves, a graduate student in criminology at the University of Oregon, who was researching rural crime patterns for his doctoral dissertation. Reeves had been examining various collections of historical documents when he encountered the boarding house materials and recognized their significance for understanding criminal enterprises of the early 20th century. Reeves's subsequent investigation, conducted over 3 years and documented in exhaustive detail in his 1964 doctoral dissertation, provided the most comprehensive analysis of the boarding house operation and its connections to broader patterns of worker surveillance and control in the Pacific Northwest timber industry. His research revealed that the Hastings boarding house had been part of a sophisticated network of information-gathering operations designed to monitor and suppress labor organizing efforts during a critical period in the industry's development. The graduate students' research methods were thorough and systematic, involving examination of corporate records, labor union archives, personal correspondence, and newspaper reports from dozens of communities throughout Oregon and Washington. His work revealed patterns of similar establishments operating throughout the region during the same period, all characterized by the same methods of worker manipulation and information gathering that had characterized the Hastings operation. Through painstaking examination of corporate records, labor union archives, and personal correspondence, Reeves documented how information gathered at establishments like the boarding house was used to identify and neutralize union organizers, political activists, and other individuals who posed threats to the established order in timber communities. Workers who displayed leadership qualities or expressed dissatisfaction with working conditions found themselves targeted by precisely orchestrated scandals that destroyed their credibility and effectiveness within the workforce. The system's effectiveness lay in its apparent randomness and the way it exploited existing prejudices about worker behavior. Men who became victims of the boarding house's operations appeared to have brought their troubles upon themselves through poor judgment or moral failings. The charges that consumed their wages seemed to result from drunken decisions or character weaknesses, while the personal scandals that later destroyed their reputations appeared to stem from unrelated moral lapses rather than systematic manipulation. This appearance of individual responsibility for their misfortunes prevented victims from organizing effective resistance to the operations that targeted them. Men who attempted to expose the boarding house's methods found their credibility undermined by the embarrassing circumstances of their own experiences, while the systematic nature of the operations remained hidden beneath the appearance of isolated incidents. Reeves's investigation also provided disturbing insight into the fate of Mrs. Hastings and her 3 missing boarders. Through analysis of correspondence found in the hidden chamber and examination of fragmentary records from other similar operations, he was able to trace what appeared to be a carefully planned evacuation, executed when the operation came under increased scrutiny from Deputy Krensky. The missing boarders, according to Reeves's analysis, had likely discovered aspects of the boarding house's true purpose and represented potential threats to the broader network's security. References in Mrs. Hastings's notes suggested that Jasper Crenshaw had begun to question the repeated memory lapses he experienced and had started keeping a private diary, documenting his suspicions about the boarding house's operations. Crenshaw's diary, fragments of which were found among Mrs. Hastings' papers, revealed a man struggling to understand experiences that seemed to defy rational explanation. His entries described increasingly sophisticated attempts to maintain awareness during his stays at the boarding house, including efforts to remain awake all night and strategies for detecting the presence of foreign substances in his food and drink. The diary entries also revealed that Crenshaw had begun to notice patterns in the behavior of other boarders that suggested they were experiencing similar problems. He had attempted to organize informal discussions among the men about their shared experiences, efforts that would have represented a significant threat to the boarding house's operations if they had been allowed to continue. Virgil Donovan had apparently noticed the photographic equipment in the basement and had begun asking questions about its purpose that threatened to expose Mrs. Hastings's documentation activities. His background as a timber grader had provided him with observational skills and attention to detail that made him particularly dangerous as a potential witness to the boarding house's true operations. Quincy Holbrook's situation was more complex and ultimately more dangerous. As the records indicated, he had discovered the hidden chamber and had attempted to use his knowledge to extract money from Mrs. Hastings. His mechanical expertise had apparently enabled him to detect the concealed entrance to the hidden room, and his discovery of its contents had led him to attempt blackmail of his own. The records suggested that Holbrook had demanded substantial payment in exchange for his silence about the boarding house's operations. This attempt to turn the tables on Mrs. Hastings had represented an existential threat to the entire network, as exposure of one operation would likely have led to investigations of similar establishments throughout the region. Evidence of their ultimate fate emerged in 1963 during construction of a new logging road approximately 15 miles east of Millhaven in a remote area of the Mount Hood National Forest. Road construction crews discovered human remains buried in a forest clearing that showed signs of having been deliberately concealed for many years. The discovery was made by a crew working for the Forest Service under a contract to improve access roads for timber harvesting operations. The remains were uncovered when heavy equipment excavating a roadbed encountered what initially appeared to be an old campsite or clearing. Closer examination revealed that the site contained carefully buried human remains, along with personal effects that had been preserved by the dry conditions typical of the region's forest floors. The bones of 3 adult males were found, along with personal effects that, when examined by authorities, matched descriptions of items belonging to the missing boarders. The remains showed evidence of violent trauma consistent with execution-style killings, suggesting that the men had been murdered and their bodies disposed of in a location chosen for its remoteness and the unlikelihood of discovery. The methodical nature of the disposal indicated planning and resources beyond what might be expected of a simple boarding house operator, supporting Reeves's theory about the broader network that had supported Mrs. Hastings's operations. The burial site was located far from any established trails or regularly visited areas, requiring detailed knowledge of the local terrain and access to transportation that would not attract attention. Mrs. Hastings herself had vanished more completely than her victims. Despite extensive research involving examination of travel records, immigration documents, and employment files from logging communities throughout the western United States and Canada, Reeves found no reliable evidence of her whereabouts after September 1927. The few leads he developed suggested either that she had successfully assumed a new identity and relocated to a distant region, or that she had met the same fate as her boarders, eliminated by the network she had served to protect its security. The sophistication of her disappearance and the complete absence of any trace of her subsequent activities suggested resources and planning that went far beyond what an individual operator could have arranged independently. The implications of Reeves's research extended far beyond the specific case of the Hastings boarding house. His documentation of the worker surveillance network revealed how corporate interests in the timber industry had systematically infiltrated and monitored their workforce during a critical period of labor organization. The boarding house operation represented just one element in a comprehensive system designed to identify and neutralize threats to established power structures through blackmail, intimidation, and, when necessary, elimination. The psychological techniques employed at the boarding house also provided insight into early forms of systematic behavioral manipulation and information extraction. The use of chemical agents to induce controlled amnesia, combined with careful documentation of victims' responses and vulnerabilities, represented sophisticated understanding of human psychology that was remarkable for its era. Mrs. Hastings had effectively operated a primitive research facility, studying how individuals responded to chemical manipulation and psychological pressure while using the knowledge gained to refine her techniques. The systematic nature of her experiments and the detailed documentation she maintained suggested that the boarding house served not only as a source of immediate intelligence, but as a laboratory for developing more effective methods of human control. Reeves's dissertation was completed and accepted by his academic committee in 1964, but it was never published in its complete form. The University of Oregon administration, reportedly responding to pressure from business interests with connections to the timber industry, required substantial revisions that would have eliminated most of the specific evidence linking the boarding house operation to legitimate corporations and political figures. The required revisions would have reduced the dissertation to a general study of rural crime patterns, without the specific documentation that made it valuable for understanding the systematic nature of worker surveillance and control. Rather than compromise his research integrity, Reeves chose to leave the manuscript unpublished, though copies were preserved in the university archives for future researchers who might be able to present the findings under more favorable circumstances. The personal cost of his investigation became apparent in the months following completion of his dissertation. Reeves, who had displayed exceptional intellectual capability and investigative skill throughout his graduate studies, began experiencing what his advisors described as increasing anxiety and paranoia related to his research. He claimed that he was being followed and threatened by individuals connected to the timber industry interests he had investigated, though university officials and local authorities could find no evidence to support these claims. The graduate student's concerns seemed to center on his belief that powerful interests were determined to prevent publication of his research and would take action against him personally if he attempted to publicize his findings. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and he began taking elaborate precautions to protect his research materials and personal safety that his colleagues found both puzzling and concerning. In December 1964, 6 months after submitting his dissertation, Reeves suffered what was officially described as a severe mental breakdown. According to medical records from Oregon State Hospital in Salem, where he was subsequently committed, he displayed symptoms of acute paranoid ideation and claimed that his life was in danger from powerful interests seeking to suppress his research. The hospital staff found no evidence to support his fears, but noted that his anxiety appeared to be genuinely debilitating, rather than deliberately fabricated. His condition was diagnosed as acute stress reaction, with paranoid features, possibly brought on by the intensive nature of his research, and the disturbing material he had uncovered during his investigation. During Reeves' hospitalization, which lasted 18 months, his research materials were reportedly destroyed in a fire that affected a section of the university archives. The fire was attributed to faulty electrical wiring in an older section of the building, though the timing of the incident raised questions among those familiar with the controversy surrounding his research. When Reeves was finally released in 1966, he displayed no memory of his research on the boarding house case and showed no interest in returning to academic work. The treatment he had received during his hospitalization had apparently been successful in eliminating his paranoid ideation, but it had also erased his recollection of the work that had led to his breakdown. He spent his remaining years working in various clerical positions in government offices, never again displaying the intellectual curiosity and analytical skill that had characterized his graduate work. Colleagues who had known him before his breakdown described the change in his personality as complete and irreversible, as though the man who had conducted the boarding house investigation had simply ceased to exist. The destruction of Reeves's research materials eliminated the most comprehensive documentation of the boarding house operation and its connections to broader patterns of worker surveillance and control. However, his work had not been entirely lost. In 1967, during renovation of the Millhaven Post Office building, workers discovered a cache of correspondence that had been hidden in the basement for decades. The letters, dating from 1926 and 1927, provided independent confirmation of many of the connections that Reeves had documented in his lost research. The correspondence included communications between Mrs. Hastings and several prominent individuals in the regional timber industry, detailing the exchange of information and money for intelligence-gathering services. The discovery of the letters was made by a renovation crew hired to modernize the post office building, which had been constructed in 1891 and had undergone only minimal maintenance since that time. The workers were removing outdated equipment from the basement when they discovered a sealed wooden box hidden behind a false wall that had been concealed by decades of accumulated debris. The box contained more than 40 letters spanning a 2-year period, along with several photographs, and what appeared to be financial records documenting payments for services rendered. The correspondence revealed a network of communication that extended throughout the Pacific Northwest timber region and provided detailed insight into the coordination of worker surveillance activities. Among the most significant documents were letters discussing the worker problem and strategies for controlling union organizing activities, with specific references to the value of the psychological profiling and blackmail materials being provided by the boarding house operation. The letters revealed that information gathered at Mrs. Hastings's establishment was being used to identify potential labor organizers before they could build significant followings among the workforce. Other letters detailed payments for information and services, with amounts that corresponded to the financial records found in the boarding house's hidden room. The payments were substantial, confirming that intelligence gathering and worker control activities had been Mrs. Hastings' primary sources of revenue rather than legitimate boarding house operations. Most significantly, the letters included detailed discussions of contingency plans for shutting down the boarding house operation if it attracted unwanted official attention. The correspondence revealed that Mrs. Hastings had been in regular communication with a network of similar operators in other communities, sharing techniques and coordinating responses to law enforcement scrutiny. The letters also contained references to elimination protocols for individuals who posed security threats to the network, providing disturbing context for the disappearance of the three boarders and the subsequent discovery of their remains in the forest burial site. The casual tone of these discussions suggested that violence was considered a routine aspect of protecting the network's operations. The discovery of these letters prompted brief renewed interest in the boarding house case, but efforts to conduct new investigations faced immediate and significant obstacles. The key witnesses were dead or missing, the physical evidence had been destroyed or lost, and the few surviving records were scattered across multiple archives that proved reluctant to provide access to researchers. More troubling was the apparent continuing reluctance of timber industry interests to permit examination of historical corporate records that might shed additional light on the network's operations. Companies that had been identified in the correspondence claimed that their historical records had been lost or destroyed, while others simply refused to cooperate with researchers seeking access to materials from the 1920s. By 1968, official interest in the case had again faded, and the letters were filed away with other historical materials at the Oregon State Archives. The story of the Hastings boarding house returned to the status of local legend, occasionally surfacing in regional publications as an example of colorful criminal enterprise from the area's past, but lacking the documented evidence needed to support serious historical analysis. The site where the boarding house once stood has remained undeveloped since its demolition in 1929, though it has changed ownership several times over the intervening decades. The Henderson Lumber Company, which purchased the property for log storage, found that the ground was unsuitable for their intended purpose due to drainage problems that made the area too muddy for heavy equipment during much of the year. Subsequent owners have encountered similar difficulties, with various attempts to develop the property being abandoned due to what contractors describe as unusual foundation problems. Geological surveys have revealed no obvious explanation for the construction difficulties encountered, though the prevalence of underground springs in the area may contribute to the unstable soil conditions. Local residents consistently report that the location possesses an unsettling quality that discourages extended presence, describing a persistent sense of unease that seems unconnected to any visible features of the landscape. The few people who have attempted to spend time on the property describe feeling watched or followed, even when they are obviously alone. These reports might be dismissed as the products of local legend and suggestion, but their consistency across multiple decades and among individuals who were unaware of the property's history suggests that the psychological effects of the boarding house's operations may have extended beyond its immediate victims. The systematic trauma that was inflicted at the site may have left traces that continue to affect sensitive individuals who encountered the location. Today, the site is marked only by a slight depression in the ground, where the basement excavation once stood, and scattered foundation stones that indicate the corners of the original structure. The surrounding area has been reclaimed by second-growth forest, typical of the region, and casual visitors would find nothing to suggest that the location once housed one of the most methodically documented criminal enterprises in Oregon's history. The broader implications of the boarding house operation continue to resonate in the labor history of the Pacific Northwest. though these effects are often subtle and difficult to trace directly. The systematic collection of worker intelligence and the use of blackmail and intimidation to control union organizing efforts had lasting impacts on the development of labor movements throughout the timber industry. The knowledge that personal information could be weaponized against workers created a culture of caution and mutual suspicion that persisted long after the specific threats had been eliminated. Workers learned to be circumspect about sharing personal information or expressing political opinions that might be used against them, a lesson that was passed down through generations and continues to influence labor relations in the region. Perhaps most disturbing is the strong likelihood that the Hastings operation was not unique or isolated. The sophistication of the techniques employed, the coordination with similar establishments in other communities, and the support provided by legitimate business interests all suggest that the boarding house was part of a broader system that operated throughout the region during the 1920s and possibly beyond. The true scope of this network may never be fully understood, as the individuals and institutions responsible for its development possess both the motivation and the capability to eliminate evidence of their involvement. The destruction of research materials, the disappearance of key witnesses, and the continuing reluctance of corporate interests to permit examination of historical records all suggest that powerful forces remain committed to preventing full disclosure of the network's operations. The psychological manipulation techniques pioneered at establishments like the Hastings boarding house also raise troubling questions about other applications of systematic behavioral control during the same period. The careful documentation of how individuals responded to chemical incapacitation and psychological pressure represented knowledge that could have been applied in various contexts beyond labor surveillance. The ultimate disposition of this knowledge, like that of the individuals who developed it, remains unknown but potentially significant for understanding the development of more sophisticated manipulation techniques in later periods. The boarding house may have served as a testing ground for methods that were subsequently applied in other contexts where systematic control of human behavior was desired. The story of the Hastings boarding house serves as a reminder that the history of American labor relations includes chapters that have been deliberately obscured and forgotten by those who benefit from historical amnesia. The men who disappeared from that yellow building at the end of Sawdust Street were victims not only of individual criminal enterprise, but of systematic efforts to suppress the rights and freedoms that workers sought to claim during a pivotal period in the nation's industrial development. The promise that no worker would sleep at the boarding house without owing something by morning proved to be a literal truth that extended far beyond simple financial obligation. The men who passed through those doors found themselves indebted in ways they could not understand or remember, trapped in a system that consumed not only their wages, but their autonomy, their dignity, and ultimately their lives. The debt they incurred was paid not only by themselves, but by the broader community of workers whose organizing efforts were systematically undermined by the intelligence gathered through their exploitation. The boarding house served as a weapon in a larger war against worker solidarity and collective action, a war whose effects continue to influence labor relations throughout the American economy. The rain still falls on the forests of Clackamas County, and timber operations continue throughout the region, though the industry has been transformed by technological advances and regulatory oversight that would have been unimaginable in 1927. The workers who labor in modern facilities enjoy legal protections and collective bargaining rights that their predecessors could only dream of achieving. Yet the legacy of the boarding house serves as a sobering reminder of how easily such protections can be undermined by those with sufficient resources and determination to exploit human vulnerability. The yellow building is gone, demolished, and forgotten by all but a few researchers and local historians who occasionally stumble across references to its existence in obscure archives. But the lessons it taught about the price of powerlessness and the importance of vigilance remain as relevant today as they were nearly a century ago. The systematic exploitation documented at the Hastings boarding house represents not merely a historical curiosity, but a warning about the eternal struggle between those who labor and those who seek to profit from their labor without regard for their humanity or dignity. The techniques of surveillance, manipulation, and control that were pioneered in that remote Oregon establishment continue to evolve and find new applications in contemporary society. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the boarding house is the reminder that the apparent security of legal protections and democratic institutions cannot be taken for granted. The men who suffered and died in that remote Oregon establishment believed they lived in a society governed by law and basic human decency. Yet they found themselves trapped in a system that operated entirely outside such constraints. Their experience serves as a warning that vigilance and solidarity among working people remain essential safeguards against exploitation, regardless of the apparent protections provided by law and custom. The forces that created and sustained the boarding house operation have not disappeared, but have merely adapted to changing circumstances and found new methods for achieving the same goals. The debt that the boarding house continues to collect is the obligation to remember these victims and to ensure that their suffering was not entirely in vain. It is the responsibility to remain alert to new forms of exploitation and manipulation that may emerge as technology and social conditions evolve. Most importantly, it is the duty to recognize that the fundamental conflict between human dignity and economic exploitation that characterized the boarding house operation continues in different forms today. This conflict requires the same courage and determination from contemporary workers that their predecessors attempted to display in the forests of Oregon nearly a century ago. The Yellow House may be gone, but the struggle it represents continues wherever workers seek fair treatment and basic respect from those who control their economic destiny. In the end, the story of the Hastings boarding house is not merely about events that occurred in a remote lumber town during the 1920s. It is about the eternal struggle for human dignity in the face of systematic exploitation, a struggle that continues wherever workers seek to organize and improve their conditions against the resistance of those who profit from their labor. The boarding house stands as a monument to the ingenuity of exploitation and the persistence of those who seek to control and profit from human vulnerability. But it also serves as a reminder that such systems depend ultimately on the isolation and powerlessness of their victims, and that solidarity and collective action remain the most effective defenses against systematic oppression. The rain that falls on the Oregon forests carries with it the memory of those who suffered and died in pursuit of dignity and fair treatment. Their legacy lives not in the forgotten foundation stones that mark the site of their exploitation, but in the continuing struggle of working people everywhere to claim and defend their fundamental rights as human beings.